This is Neil Hansen. I'm a diagnostic radiologist in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm here to give the Physics Lecture 3 talk about X-ray tubes and spectra. Giving it live, I usually have the audience do poll everywhere. Because it's being recorded, there is a link within the description on YouTube to log into a survey quiz to do the questions along with the lecture. I think that helps keep you engaged, awake, and filling it out, and you are encouraged to do so. Just remember, defeat. For every winner, there are dozens of losers, and odds are you're one of them. No, I'm just joking. It's pretty difficult to get through physics as a radiology resident. I find a lot of people are more interested in the clinical aspects of radiology, despite what they may say during their residency interview about how much they love physics. You're taking call when you're prepping for a core exam, that kind of stuff. Don't feel defeated. You will win. Most of us make it through. Keep your heads up. Alright, here's some suggested references for the X-ray tubes and spectra talk. The X-ray modules on the RSNA website are pretty good. Physics War Machine covers everything in its basics, and there are other references you can find through your more senior residents at your program. What are the goals of this specific talk? One, we want to talk about X-ray tubes, go into depth about anodes, cathodes, and much more. Here's the link for the poll everywhere quiz. Again, the link is in the descriptor of the YouTube video. Alright, so if we remember from last time, we talked about Bremsstrahlung and the fact that X-rays created through Bremsstrahlung interactions are both polyenergetic and polydirectional. So if you think about, an X-ray source like this block here that's creating a bunch of random X-rays that are going every which direction, most of them are going to be along the lower energy spectra. So most of the X-rays produced are going to be down here at the lower energy levels. There's going to be relatively few X-rays which are at your maximum kVp in your imaging setup. So most of them are this lower energy X-rays that really only contribute to patient scatter and patient dose. Each material has its own X-ray spectra, and if you look at an X-ray spectra, from 0 up to the max kV, the maximum photon energy, most of the Bremsstrahlung X-rays are in this low spot. You have peaks of characteristic radiation produced per given material, and then you have the relatively fewer high energy photons created at the right aspect of the curve. Here's again a X-ray spectra from a mammogram. Showed this last time. Much cleaner spectra with relatively fewer random Bremsstrahlung X-rays and many more characteristic X-rays being produced due to the photoelectric setup for mammography. Alright, so question. What is the dominant photon interaction for typical X-ray use in diagnostic radiography and soft tissues? You can pause now. Oh, I did it again. I swear to God, I apologize. I will clear this up. If you're a complete idiot, you'll guess anything other than B. Again, I guess I could pretend that I'll go back and edit that part out, but in reality, I'm being paid nothing for this service, so I'm probably not going to. Correct answer is Compton scatter. Another question, which of the following is correct in terms of the chance of the photoelectric absorption occurring? You can pause now if you need more time. The correct answer, which is a review from last time, is that it's proportional to the atomic number cubed and inversely proportional to the photon energy cubed. In mammography, contrast between small calcifications and adjacent fibroglandular tissue is primarily due to which effect? You can pause now if you need more time. The correct answer is the photoelectric effect. A lot of those are just reviews from last time. Alright, X-ray spectra. Lower energy X-rays are much more commonly produced, but we don't see them in routine X-ray spectra generated during diagnostic imaging because they are absorbed in the target material, for example in the tungsten anode, or alternatively in filters that we set up to purposely get rid of them. So if you look at the original X-ray spectra from a diagram, it would be somewhat of a linear fashion from the lowest energy photons all the way up to the highest energy photons or X-rays. This is the original spectrum with spikes from characteristic X-rays. If you look at the attenuated spectrum, what's actually coming and being exposed to the patient, it looks considerably different from that because a lot of these lower energy photons are absorbed within the anode material, and also we put filters in place to get rid of this big chunk of useless photon energy that just contributes to patient dose. So to get into the specifics of the X-ray tube, we have to talk about the glass vacuum, which is usually lined with lead and has only a small window for the X-rays to come out, which is directed obviously towards the patient. The cathode, which is a tungsten filament, which is the source of electrons, that has a focusing cup to direct them again towards the anode and create X-rays. And then the anode target, which is usually spun around on an axis, most commonly made of tungsten, or in the case of mammography, molybdenum or rhodium. We showed this last time. This is the basic schematic for an X-ray tube, where you have a rotor with a spinning anode which spins to improve heat dissipation, filament causing thermionic emission of electrons going towards the anode target. Those electrons cause local interactions in the anode target, and eventually X-rays are produced going through a set of filters and collimators before hitting the patient. Why do we use shielding? Well, it eliminates useless scatter. So if you think about all the X-rays being produced within an X-ray tube, most of them are going in the wrong direction. They're only going to contribute to patient dose. They're only going to contribute to dose experienced by medical personnel, either within the room or in an adjacent room if there isn't proper shielding. So the whole thing is lined in lead except for the exit window where we want to direct the X-rays. All right, next question. What is the maximum amount of leakage or scatter radiation allowed at max tube voltage in a fluoroscopy room 1 meter from the unit? Pause now if you need more time. The correct answer is 100 milliroentgen or 1 millisievert. And why is that important? Well, when you design a room, or for like accreditation purposes, when your physicist measures the amount of scatter in a room, if you're above this threshold, you have to do something to fix it. Also, when you set up a room, you have to make sure that your design is set to make sure that this threshold is not surpassed. Let's get into depth about the cathode. The cathode is an external energy source, obviously like a power plant, which is supplying power to a hospital or an outpatient imaging clinic, supplies current, which heats the filament and boils off the electrons via thermionic emission. Current is just the rate of flow of electrical charge, so current can be measured in coulombs of charge per second. Ampere, the unit amp, is 1 coulomb of charge per second. So just basically the unit of current is an amp, defined as 1 coulomb of charge per second. Clinical X-ray tubes are usually around 4 to 5 amps. So what people frequently will get as a misconception is they think 4 to 5 amps as the X-ray tube current, which is true. So that's the current going through the X-ray tube itself. However, that's not what we're going to be exposing the patient to. Usually, like a CT, for example, you set the parameters for the current that's going to be exposed to a patient or going to be used to expose a patient to X-rays, and usually that's in milliamps, which is something, like 10 to 500 milliamps at maximum. And a lot of CTs actually automatically adjust the current utilized to expose the patient based off of their size or thickness, etc., with automated limits so a patient isn't burned. But the amount of amperage or current that it takes to actually run an X-ray tube is measured in amps, not milliamps. So in absence of an energy difference or potential, the electrons just kind of sit there, they're boiled off and don't move. So you have to apply a potential difference, i.e. the kVp, to make them move. So what's a potential? It's just a difference from the cathode to the anode, which causes those electrons to move in the direction towards the anode. More stupid nomenclature. All right, so you have to know what a volt is. What is a volt? It's a unit of energy. And frequently we'll talk about things in physics related to diagnostic imaging in terms of electron volts. That's the energy gained by an electron when it is accelerated across a 1 volt potential. Amps, again, are just the rate of flow of electrical charges. And then we have this new nomenclature, this new entity, power. Power is measured in watts, and it takes into account both the energy and the rate of flow of charge. So it's the current in amps times the voltage in volts. So amps times volts equals watts. All right, clinical X-ray generators use up to how much electrical power? Pause now if you need more time. The correct answer is 100 kilowatts, which is about 30 U.S. households. So to run an X-ray machine, say in our diagnostic radiology department, how much is the electrical bill? Well, it would probably be about as much annually as 30 U.S. households. If you look at different power sources, how much power they use, how much energy is used per second measured in joules. Flashlight, about 2 watts. If you look at a domestic light bulb, you're talking 50 watts. Microwaves up to 500 watts. Average U.S. home can at any given time be using up to 3,000 watts. X-ray generators take 100,000 watts. So obviously to have one of these, you have to have special hookups for your power supply, and it's going to be very expensive to run. That's why medical imaging is so expensive. That and the machine itself costs about $1 million to $4 million, depending on what kind of machine you're talking about. It's not that I'm getting paid a whole bunch. I don't see any of that money. That all goes through the hospital. All right, concepts. 2 currents are going on in X-ray tubes. One is the current from the power plant, which is boiling off the filament, measured in amps. The second is the electrons going from the cathode to the anode to bombard a target and make X-rays. That's usually what we're referring to when you're talking about the diagnostic settings for like a CT scan, and that's measured in milliamps, which is like 25 to 1,000 at most. Usually, most CT scanners have a limit where they won't exceed a certain amperage, and oftentimes that's around 500 or 600 milliamps. What directs electrons in a beam rather than at random? Well, it's called the focusing cup. So what is the focusing cup? It's a negatively charged cup that repels electrons into the center of it and then focuses them towards their journey across the tube potential towards the anode. So if we look at a focusing cup, it's basically a device that's negatively charged, and it pushes the negatively charged electrons together in a beam in a linear fashion towards the anode at the target site. So it's just this kind of cup that's fully negatively charged, and again pushes all those negatively charged electrons into a line to go towards that anode target across a potential. The focal spot is what we call the target site of the anode. The electron beam generated is focused onto that spot in the anode, called the focal spot, and different setups have different focal spot sizes depending on what task you're doing. If you talk about something like mammography, where you're really needing to see very small microcalcifications, the focal spot is going to be teeny tiny, like 0.05 millimeters. For CT, where you don't need quite as much anatomic detail as you would need like a mammographic image, the focal spot is going to be bigger, and there's going to be more areas and more current involved, so you have to have a larger focal spot to dissipate heat, and the focal spot for CT might be something like 2.5 millimeters. Many clinical X-ray tubes have 2 different filaments. Some even have more filaments with different focal spot sizes, so you can use them differently based off of your setup, whether you're doing like a big abdominal or chest radiograph, or whether you're doing like a very small dedicated wrist radiograph, for example. Depending on the task at hand, different clinical X-ray tubes may use different filaments. The anode. To go into detail about the anode, it's positively charged, and it needs the following characteristics. It has to be a good conductor of heat, has to be a good conductor of electricity, has to have a high melting point, has to have a high atomic number. A rotating anode is used in most X-ray tubes to increase which of the following? Why does it rotate? Pause now if you need more time. The correct answer is the focal loading, the effective target or anode area, allows for a smaller focal spot, right? So you can have a functionally smaller focal spot if you rotate it around to dissipate heat. That's the reason why. Because if you just had a non-rotating small focal spot, what would happen is the anode would literally melt from the heat generated. So it just rotates around, so you can use a smaller focal spot and dissipate heat throughout the rotating anode. Anode materials, again, tungsten is most commonly used for radiography, CT, fluoroscopy, IR. Molybdenum is most commonly used for mammography. both used mostly because of their high melting points versus like gold. Gold would be a suitable material in most respects if we go back to anode, other than the fact that it would melt at the heat generated, which would be bad. So the anode summary, the physical size of the focal spot is important because it determines the resolution of your radiographs. And if you have a radiograph like a wrist x-ray looking for a subtle scaphoid fracture, you really are going to need a focal spot which is smaller for your setup. The smaller the focal spot, the less geometric blur that occurs and the higher resolution radiographs that will be produced. A focusing cup and a small cathode filament are used to make a small focal spot, so the setup in the cathode helps determine the focal spot in the anode. And then again, we use a beveled anode, so it's slightly angulated, it's not hitting it at a 90-degree angle. That helps keep the focal spot small but dissipate heat. The downside to that beveled anode is what we kind of talked about last time, which is the heel effect. So the beveled anode is an anode here at this angle, marked theta randomly here. And why do we need that? Because it creates a smaller apparent focal spot with a larger irradiated target. If you think about, the steeper the angle, the larger the area of that given focal spot that's coming out of the target, towards the target, which is the patient. This larger area allows, again, for heat dissipation, and it's just a way to get a smaller focal spot with more heat dissipation. So using the line focus principle causes something called the heel effect. What is the line focus principle? Well, it's illustrated here. And as the cathode burns those electrons off, they hit the focal spot, which is beveled at an angle. The apparent focal spot for x-rays that are coming at an angle and hitting here towards the cathode side is actually a little bit bigger, because if you look at the angle of this bevel coming towards the apparent focal spot at this part of the patient, the cathode side of the patient, versus the apparent focal spot on the anode side, which has a steeper angle here and creates a relatively smaller surface area. So that causes essentially the heel effect, right? There's going to be more radiation coming over here, less radiation over here. You're going to have a smaller apparent focal spot with better resolution over here, a larger apparent focal spot with less resolution over here. Given some of the x-rays made are absorbed by thicker anode material near the anode side, that beam intensity is again higher at the cathode side, which is what I just kind of said. Larger focal spot, more intense beam, smaller focal spot, less intense beam here towards the anode side. That's all just because within this anode material, some of those x-rays are being attenuated and absorbed. All right, next question. What does the tech do to minimize the heel effect for a radiograph? Pause now if you need more time. Correct answer is all of the above. So they place the cathode over the thicker part of the body. For example, like on a chest x-ray, that would be down towards the abdomen. They collimate as much as possible to get the center of the beam. If you look at this, the center of the beam is where there's less heel effect, because there's less difference between here and here than there is between here and here. They move the image receptor as far away as possible, because if you move the image receptor farther away, it will minimize the effect of the heel. And so all of the above was correct. All right. The heel effect is most likely to increase when reducing which of the following? Pause now if you need more time. The correct answer is anode angle, the anode angle. So if you go through these, the heel effect is most likely to increase when what is reduced. So when tube voltage is reduced, no, actually the heel effect is worse as you increase voltage. When tube current is reduced, nope, that's not correct either. The anode angle, as you reduce the anode angle, as it becomes steeper, that heel effect actually becomes worse because of the angulation of the bevel on the anode. Filtration, is that going to if you reduce filtration, is that going to increase the heel effect? Not really. Same thing with field size. All right, anode angle. So if you look at the anode angle here, where you have a smaller anode angle, you have a narrower useful beam. If you have a greater anode angle, it's going to have a wider useful beam. So again, like if you can't understand the heel effect, I would urge you to look up some good YouTube videos. There's some people that talk about this for 10 minutes at a time. to get you through it. But just remember, if you can't remember anything else, as the angle of the anode increases, the anode heal effect increases as well. This can result in incomplete coverage of the film with the useful part of the beam. So there's a limit to how much you can angle the heal. All right, again, cathode side, more intense, thicker part. So here you can see the vertebral bodies very well, with the cathode directed down towards the thicker part of the body. Here where the anode, the less intense beam is, you can't really see through it, and everything up here becomes bleeded out because all the x-rays on the more intense cathode side have penetrated through to the image receptor, and essentially you get no contrast up here as a result. That video, if you're interested, was just a good video on the heal effect. Since I've beaten it to death, I'm not going to show it right now. You can look it up if you're interested. All right, 3 components to manipulate and tweak the beam in an X-ray tube generator. What can we change? We can change the MA, or the current going across the cathode to anode. We can change the kVp, which is just the potential across the cathode to anode. And we can change the exposure time, which is how often the whole setup is on from beginning to end. kVp, so this determines the voltage between the cathode and anode. It determines the amount of kinetic energy and maximum energy you can give to the electrons which go across the process, and it determines really the quality of the X-ray beam that's produced. MA is more the quantity of X-rays produced. This controls the supply of thermionic emission from the heated cathode filament. So I like to think of kVp as the quality of the beam, and the MA as the quantity of the beam in terms of X-ray generation. Here's the key point. X-ray production varies linearly with MA. So if you double the MA, you're going to double the flow of electrons from cathode to anode, and you're going to double the number of X-rays that are generated. It's very simple. You cut the MA in half, X-ray production is cut in half. KV is a lot more complex than that. All right, increasing energy flow to the X-ray tube filament will most likely result in an increase in X-ray tube which of the following. Pause now if you need more time. The correct answer is current. So if you increase energy flow, I mean by default that's going to increase current, right? It's not going to change the voltage at all. It's not going to change the filtration. It's not going to change the exposure time. We control those other elements. But if you increase energy flow to that filament, it's going to increase the flow of charges and increase current by definition. All right, but how strongly is the beam that's eventually emitted? For a tungsten target, the average X-ray spectra after attenuation in the anode, after it's scattered, after it's filtered, it's really only about a third to half of the maximum energy. So if we set our kVp at 65, the average energy of an X-ray coming out of our setup is going to be about 27. So that's what the patient will be exposed to. The relationship of changing kVp to the X-rays produced and the X-ray spectra that's generated is complex. That's because kVp affects X-ray production differently than MA. X-ray production is much more efficient at higher electron kinetic energies, so the X-ray production is actually proportional to the square of the fractional kVp change. So it's an exponential process. Also, the higher kVp there is, the higher the energy photons produce, and those have increased patient penetration and arrival at the image detector. So if you make functionally more energetic photons, more of them on average will reach the image detector because they'll travel through everything because they have a higher functional energy. What do you need to memorize? Well, I would remember this. A 15 to 20% change in kVp results in increasing the radiation intensity detected at the image detector by a factor of 1.5 to 2. So a 15 to 20% kVp change can almost double the X-ray production as it's eventually detected at the receptor. And this graph really just kind of illustrates this. If you look at a kVp of 50 and then you jump up to 70, there's an exponential jump in the number of X-rays which are produced. Again, 90. So if you compare the area under the curve at 50 to 110, the number of X-rays produced is much more than double here. It's an exponential increase as you increase this kVp. All right, increasing X-ray tube technique from 60 kilovolts to 72 kilovolts, the radiation output of the tube will increase by a factor of about what? I'll let you think about this, pause if you need more time. The correct answer is 1.4. So you could get that just by the little trick I told you, right? Going from 60 to 72, that's an increase of 12, so that's about a 20% increase in kV. If you do the math on that, 20% increase in kV should result in 1.5 to 2 times increase in the number of X-rays produced. So 1.4 is the number that's closest to 2.5, or to 1.5 to 2 there. So that would be the correct answer. If you're someone that's more mathematically inclined, since it's proportional to the square root, or the proportional to the change squared, if you take 72 squared divided by 60 squared, that gives you 1.4. So if you're someone that's really good at math, which sadly I am no longer good at math. I spent most of my weekend while on lockdown trying to learn Common Core math for a 7th grader. Nearly killed me, but I got it done. You know, if you're math inclined, this is how you would actually calculate it out. All right, this graph is very, very important. On the core exam, they want to try and show you pictures. This is a picture which illustrates physics concepts. And so to go through this in some detail, so if you have a baseline energy spectra, here's your average energy, which is about 25. This is created from a tungsten target of 65 kVp, 250 mA. So if you jump, so if you look at this graph versus this graph, what did we change? We changed something that affects the quality of the beam. So 65 kVp went up to 100. So not only do we generate more X-rays because the area under the curve here got significantly bigger, but we generated more powerful X-rays. The average energy increased up to probably 35 to 40 here versus 25 here. So if I showed you these two graphs and just asked what changed, you know, based off of the average energy, that the kVp had to change there. Changing MA wouldn't change it. If you changed MA just went from 250 to 500, like we see down here in segment B, the average energy stays the same. The only thing that changes is the number of X-rays produced, so the area under the curve got bigger. So if I showed you these two pictures, you know that kVp didn't change. You know that MA had to have changed because the average energy stayed the same. The only thing different was that more X-rays were produced. If this hill got smaller, like was real tiny, and the average energy was the same, then you know that MA had to have gone down. So this makes for easy multiple choice question generation showing these type of graphs. If you change both, like you double the MA, you increase the kVp, you're going to make a lot more X-rays, and the average energy is going to go up. So this graph illustrates that. Now to talk about exposure time. So we can change kV, we can change MA, and we can also change just the overall amount of time that the whole system is up. So MA is oftentimes set in conjunction with time. How strong, how long, right? How strong is the whole current going, and how long is that current on? It creates a new term called MAS, which is just MA times time. So X-ray production is linearly associated with the exposure time as well as this new term or concept MAS. If you double exposure time, you will double X-ray generation. If you double the MAS, you will double the X-ray generation. Linear, simple relationship. If the MA is high, exposure time needs to be low to avoid overheating it. So oftentimes when things are set up, it will be a direct kind of opposite effect of MA and exposure time. So if you have a setup where your exposure time can be very low, like it's on for a millisecond taking a single wrist radiograph, you can have your MA on relatively high. But what if you're in fluoroscopy doing a enema study that takes a half hour, doing an IR procedure where the fluoro is going to be on for a couple of minutes or maybe even an hour, doing a complex IR procedure? You're going to have to change the MA to be on very low because intrinsically you need it to be on for a long time. So what happens in those setups is instead of doing like a 300 milliamp MA with a millisecond exposure time, you're going to have an exposure time in minutes, but you're going to have to drop the MA to keep the overall anode from overheating and also to just reduce the chance of like a skin burn occurring on your patient. All right, what are typical exposure times in terms of MA and exposure time for a general diagnostic radiographic study to generate one radiograph? Pause now if you need more time. The correct answer is less than a second and up to 1,000 MA. So if you think about it, if you've ever had an x-ray taken of like your femur or a chest x-ray or whatever, it doesn't take 10 seconds. Obviously, we don't make people, hold their breath and try and stay still for a wrist x-ray or a chest x-ray, because most people, especially if you're short of breath getting a chest x-ray, you can't hold it for 10 seconds. You have to hold it for less than a second, right? Up to 1,000 milliamps, less than a second is a pretty common setup. All right, KVP and MAS selection is complex. So it's not like I'm sitting there day to day saying, oh, I wonder to get a good portable chest radiograph, what I should do. What KVP and MAS should I select? Most of the time, this is a very or a complex selection process, and the machines that, modern machines do all of this work for you, essentially, in terms of selection of these. The attenuation characteristics of the beam is mostly dependent on KVP. So if you have to pick something that's most important to the overall process of X-ray generation and the characteristics of the beam produced, you're going to select KVP. This is what affects contrast visualization in the target most. Here's an example of how you can manipulate KV to change contrast. So in a lot of studies where there's a lot of inherent contrast involved, so renal stone studies such as where you're looking for high density stones, CT enterography where you're looking for contrast enhancing mucosa, other high contrast studies, some departments will do low KV studies to manipulate the radiation dose experienced by the patient. Because inherently there's a lot of contrast involved. So if you look at this and the overall dose received by the patient, what you get is a scan that looks a little bit better that actually is a lower radiation dose. And all we did was we changed 120 kV scan to 100 kV scan. We relied on the inherent contrast within the administered ionated contrast material and the background, which is in this case the bowel wall. And so that really pops out at 100 kV, which allows a lower radiation dose. So even in real life, we can do low kV scanning, to get a lower radiation dose. This would not work in someone that was like morbidly obese, like myself. Sad but true. But it would not work to do low kV scanning in someone that had a really thick body because the lower energy photons wouldn't be able to traverse through to the image detector in sufficient amounts. So if you'll notice, this is actually a kid, a really small person. Low kV scanning really only works in people that have a very low body mass index or like children that are smaller. All right, technical aspects of X-ray generators. In the United States, alternating current is used. It's bidirectional. If you've never seen the Current Wars movie, stop right now. Do nothing else but watch that movie. It was really good. Kind of why America uses alternating current. It was a fun movie. So X-ray tube generators require the use of complex transformers and rectifier circuits in the X-ray generator to keep the cathode to anode flow unidirectional and to prevent something called voltage ripple. To do this, we use something called three-phase or high-frequency inverter generators in most clinical X-ray machines. That's for like in diagnostic radiology. If you talk about like a dental X-ray machine, which has a much simpler task, they're usually used with a single-phase generator. Now to get into depth, I'm going to talk about, no, I'm just joking. Like, I don't even understand this picture here. As a diagnostic radiologist, I remember in my physics training, we had a physicist go into depth about these generators and inverters. And if you know everything on this slide right here, you know everything that I know about X-ray tube generators in terms of their technical aspects, which is enough to get me through boards and life. And not to brag, but I did buy a boat. All right, beam filtration. Beam filtration. Inherent filtration occurs in the anode. The Heal effect causes that. Additionally, we add filtration to reduce useless low energy X-rays that really only contribute to patient dose. Usually we're going to be using something like kind of what I think of as soft metals like aluminum, which has it's number 13 on the elemental or the periodic table of elements, or copper, which is 29. So kind of softer, lower density or lower weight metals. So where does it go? So you have all those X-rays being produced at the anode, coming out, and we have a filter in place before it hits the patient. This is another great multiple choice type of questionnaire where they'll show you a series of images and they'll ask you a question about filtration. So if you look here, if you take an X-ray tube setup, 100 kVp, 250 mA, you don't change anything. All you do is you put on a copper filtration or an aluminum filtration device. What's going to happen? So if you put on an aluminum filtration device, a couple things are going to happen. One, aluminum preferentially filters out the lower energy X-rays, so this part of that curve just goes away because it's all attenuated within the filter. It's all filtered out, and the beam you have has less X-rays overall, but they're at a functionally higher energy, so we functionally hardened the beam, so the curve has gone down and to the right. That's from 2.5 millimeters of aluminum added. If you keep the setup the same and add 1 millimeter of aluminum, the same thing happens, it's just to a lesser degree. So the average energy increases, but to a lesser degree because there's lesser filtration here. If you go monstrous filtration, like 1 millimeter of aluminum, 0.2 millimeters of copper, copper again has a slightly higher atomic mass unit than aluminum, so it's a better filtrator. That curve is going to go even steeper down to the right. The average energy is going to go up even higher, and you're going to have functionally less X-rays, but they're going to be much higher energy on average. So again, like, you can look at graphs and kind of predict what would happen in terms of how much and where that graph is going to move if filtration is added. Different types of filtration are used for different tasks. Changes in contrast characteristics of the images. If we want a very high contrast setup for something like an abdomen radiograph, just for example, looking for stones, then we might use a certain type of filtration. If there's a lot of inherent tissue contrast in and of itself, like for example in a chest radiograph where you're looking at air versus soft tissue and bone, then we might need a different filter setup. Taking advantage of the photoelectric effect, an anode filter pair can selectively filter most energies lower than the characteristic X-ray produced. What does that mean? So what setups are in real life is, for a given anode and a given task, you're going to pick a different filter to get rid of all the useless stuff and take advantage of things that you want, like the photoelectric effect. So if you think about like a molybdenum or a molybdenum-rhodium pair setup in mammography, it illustrates this fact well. So if you look at the original molybdenum attenuation coming out, here's what theoretically it would look like. Here's what the original spectrum looks like. Because of the Heal effect and all that stuff, getting rid of these lower energy photons. And then if you put on a filter, like you have a molybdenum setup, you put on an additional molybdenum filter, or maybe you put on a rhodium filter, and then you'll get an even more attenuated beam that relies more heavily or is more heavily composed of characteristic X-rays, which is what you want. So again, filtration causes beam hardening. I talked about this last time in the last lecture, which creates a higher energy beam. Mammography always deserves special considerations. So you need a lot of soft tissue contrast to look at cancer and calcifications. That means we need a low average kVp, usually less than 35, and oftentimes you'll use a molybdenum or a molybdenum-rhodium anode filter setup. There are a very small range of energies produced, usually around the 20 keV setup, and most of these are attenuated within the breast. You need either 1, a high MAS, or 2, a long exposure time to get enough X-rays to the detector. So we do all this contrast manipulation to get lower energy photons coming out, but the problem is those low energy photons, not enough of them are going to hit the detector. So we have to either, one, throw a bunch of MAS at it, or two, we have to have a long exposure time. In reality, you do kind of a combination of both, but MAS is limited because molybdenum has a relatively low melting point. So the result is that our only other option is to increase exposure time. So sometimes the exposure time for a mammography study can be seconds, and that's why sometimes mammograms can turn out blurry if there's patient motion, because a lot of people can't hold still for that period of time. It's also why we use those medieval torture devices, which if any of you have had a mammogram or seen a woman or even a man that got a mammogram, we put them in these compression devices, very uncomfortable, but the purpose is to keep them as still as possible so that there aren't blurry calcifications. And we have to do that because the exposure time is relatively long compared to other x-ray setups, like for example a hand x-ray. IR tubes also have to be special, so if you're in the IR unit, the tube is going to be a little bit different. There are very small structures, like very small peripheral arteries that are being worked on both for visualization and to advance a wire into it, etc. So IR tubes need small focal spots. Small focal spots tend to heat up a lot, so a lot of IR tubes have to have specialized cooling systems to allow that to be functional. IR is just too hot, so they use a small anode angle for high resolution images. That results in heating. It also increases the heel effect. Most of the time in IR, when they're using this setup, it's a very small field of view, like centered on like a small hepatic artery during a TACE or something. So it's kind of a negligible effect that usually isn't clinically relevant. Many IR tubes actually have multiple focal spots. They have a large, a small, and the micro, which avoids heating the tube too much. So if you're during the large portion of the procedure where you're threading a catheter just through the aorta, you don't need that much resolution to do that. Then as you mag up to look at like sub-selection of the celiac axis, then it'll use a different focal spot. And then if you're doing like a microcatheter embolization of like a tiny peripheral bleeding vessel in an artery somewhere, you'll really mag up and it'll use a micro focal spot. The computer does all this on its own. It's not like the IR attending is sitting there and saying change to the microscopic focal spot. That's not what happens. It just the machine automatically does all this. Most IR studies are done with iodine, so a copper filter is used to create a tube spectra close to the kh of iodine. That makes sense, right? Copper filters are oftentimes used when you're using iodine, which is what most IR studies are done with. Most IR and Flora units automatically change all of these parameters based off of image quality. The computer can detect how good the image is, and it will change all this stuff based off of the mag level that you select. CT tubes, they generally have amongst the higher kVps. They need to be cooled. Old school, you would actually have to wait in between exams for the whole setup to cool down. Boy, wouldn't it have been nice to be a radiologist back then. You could just do a CT, read it, and then you don't get another CT for 15 to 20 minutes because the tube had to cool down. Most modern units, you don't have to wait like that any longer. Helical scans, these need to be mobile around the patient. When you get into the actual CT lecture, there will be discussions about the specifications needed to alter the tube to do helical scanning, kind of beyond this talk. Dental tubes are more simple. They have a simple task, simple design. They're more similar to like veterinarian tubes, which are much cheaper to make. There's no rotating anode, single phase generator, much simpler setup. So that completes Physics Talk number 3. Thank you for paying attention. Feel free to like, subscribe, and comment as you need, but quite honestly, like I usually don't respond to the comments. So if you have a real burning question, you should probably just email me. Email is at the beginning of the radiograph because at the beginning of the PowerPoint, I'm a pretty rabid emailer. But thank you for playing along. Bye.